Behind the bright lights and adrenaline of pro sport is an equally exciting world of negotiations and deal-making.
That's what we cover each week on our podcast, The Deal.
I'm Alex Rodriguez, former baseball player turned business executive.
And I'm Jason Kelly, chief correspondent for Bloomberg Originals. Over the next couple months, we'll hear from all-stars like Jay Williams.
I want to be an owner one day.
Billie Jean King.
Learn the business.
And so many more. Listen to The Deal on Spotify.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the party opposite failed our country. Their Brexit deal harmed British businesses. There are no shortcuts. And to deliver that investment, we must restore economic stability and turn the page on the last 14 years.
Quiet Riot.
Welcome to Quiet Riot. I'm Alex Andreou. The debate on whether the new Labour government is doing the right things or the wrong things, enough of them or too much, to achieve its much ballyhooed reset of UK-EU relations is a very live debate right now, but it is largely an Anglo-centric one. How is the new Labour government perceived from an EU perspective? What does the club we just left make of our slow change of heart? What does it want in return? And how much of a priority is our reset in European capitals? I spoke to Jacob Öberg, Professor of European Law at the University of Southern Denmark and a keen follower of all things Brexit. Welcome to Quiet Riot, Jacob Öberg. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'm excited to be here.
Jacob, we did a big piece of research with Best for Britain, and we found that excluding don't knows, 56% of voters here want a closer relationship with the EU, and just over a quarter think it's about right. You wrote earlier in the year about the scope for an improved trade and cooperation agreement, or TCA as we will call it. What is that scope for a better agreement, and has it changed since the July UK election and Labour government taking over?
Yeah, that is a good question. I had hoped that there would have been more changes since the elections. It's complicated. It's a big question in a sense. I mean, we can maybe break it down a bit and talk about the details, because I think this is the big question. I think that there is, even within what we would call Keir Starmer's and Labour's red lines, significant scope for improvement, even within these red lines, outside the EU internal market, outside customs union, etc. There is a significant scope to do a lot more with the EU, which would help business, help people, help young people. So there's a lot of things that can be done, which haven't yet been done, and which there has been little work in starting. If we say from the elections, I think there is kind of a feeling that Labour haven't really decided what they're going to do and where to go with this, particularly in terms of things that the EU would request or require, demand from the UK. And we see UK, especially Labour, is very hesitant in giving any space on that. If that's kind of the situation, no one actually gives in and nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing the EU want is basically for the TCA as it is to be fully implemented, because there are still bits and pieces that they feel are not being fully implemented.
Definitely.
Now, the European Parliament has also had an election in June, and those results were also very significant.
Yes.
Has that changed things on the side of the EU, do you think?
It's very difficult to say how that changed things. I just think that this change of parliament and, the new commission has maybe slowed down things on the EU-UK front a little bit, because there is not a kind of a common approach among the EU member states and the new parliament, which is going much more right-wing. It's difficult to say what they're going with it, but it seems like there's not that much interest at the moment in kind of like resetting properly the relationship with the UK. It seems not a priority. It seems that the EU is dealing with a lot of problems of their own.
Yeah.
Partly because of the war, but also partly because there's a new kind of parliament coming in. There's a lot of these political problems in terms of rule of law. Migration is a huge thing now with new parliament and new commission. So there are things which means that the UK issue becomes kind of like very low on the kind of priority list, which I think is a bit of a regret, but I think that's an effect of the elections at the EU level as well, that it's not like a priority. And the Commission is also, as a lot of people have been saying, not yet fully formed. And we actually don't know exactly who in the Commission is going to be responsible for the UK relationship in particular. I know it was Sefcovic before, but we don't know who's going to deal with it now. So that's also a bit of like sort of uncertainty there, which means that there's been very little progress also on the EU side, which I think, sometimes people tend to forget.
Jacob, I was going to ask you about that actually, because I think one of the notable things is that a lot of the main personalities of the Brexit negotiation are now in even more influential position. So Maros Sefcovic is now vice president of the Commission. Yeah. Michel Barnier is now French prime minister.
Yeah. Yes.
Does their view of the UK have an impact on the situation?
I mean, Maros Sefcovic.
It's not an easy question, I know, but
I think it's a fair question because they're obviously very influential people at the moment on the EU political scene, both of them. So I think their perspective is that I wouldn't say they were scarred, but closer to scarred by the sort of Brexit negotiations in a way. Like
as were we all.
Yes, but they were. I think that it was kind of like this frustration where I think that Barnier was always trying to be very polite, but I think he was like absolutely horrendously tired of negotiating with the UK. So I think that he's kind of like, oh, not the UK,
not again.
Sort of this kind of. I mean, I'm joking a little bit, but I think there's some truth in this that their perspective in the UK is maybe not the most optimistic. I think there are commentators like that I very respect a lot, and like David Heinig, which is like great in trade, and he sees more like prospects and possibilities. But I also think he senses that a new blood also in the EU Commission for this. If it would be the same kind of negotiators, we're kind of like stuck with this distrustful atmosphere. Which is not very fruitful if you're going to make significant progress. Because I think this is the thing. All of these things, which, if you're talking youth mobility, a VETS agreement, all like these things, these are big, complicated negotiations in a way. So, I mean, you need like everyone on board, both the EU Commission, the UK negotiation team, everyone needs to kind of be fully sort of focused on this to get it done. So, if you're like doing it with your left hand, you're gonna get nothing done. So I mean, like there's gonna be an investment both on the UK side and on the EU side for anything to happen there, even with these small things which can be far away from getting back to the internal market.
Jacob, there's a narrative, I think, increasingly here in the UK, even among Remainers, even among very pro-EU people, that the EU is maybe becoming something that we wouldn't necessarily want to be very close to, given the rise of far-right groups in member states. What do you say to them?
I think I was going to say a very bad word now, but I do think that's kind of like...
Feel free to say the bad word. It's
a bit of not bollocks, but it's a bit of nonsense talk because, if you are at the EU level, a member state, you have the power to actually influence things, how they are going. And you're actually able to actually influence policy and politics. And you're a player at the table, especially UK was a significant player at the EU table, although skeptical on most of the time. But they were one of the big players at the EU level in terms of maybe you would consider France, Germany, like the other big sort of countries change. But they were actually influencing a lot of things when they were members. So I think it's a big mistake to be outside this because you can actually decide what you want to do with the project if you're in it. But if you're outside, you have no voice. So I think it's all about, if you have a seat at the table, you can decide where we're going with this, how we want to do with different countries, where we want to take this, etc., etc. So I find if you take this like challenge of far right or whatever, like rule of law, etc., you are actually able as a member state to influence a lot of things if you're sitting at the table.
Yeah,
the UK would maybe be like a sane voice, maybe with the new government that could actually make sort of an impact at the table and influence policies in a direction where they want it to go. So a lot more at the table than outside. So yeah,
and I think it's also slightly short-termist because the pendulum swings one way and then inevitably it swings another way. If we're talking about the long-term future, then to make that decision on the basis of the current political trend in Europe doesn't seem to me a wise thing to do. Now, on the opposite side, there are voices, strong voices, who want the UK government to make a sort of big declaration that the UK will rejoin the EU, or at least the single market or the customs union. Is it that simple, do you think? Would such a unilateral declaration of, I want this, be warmly received in EU capitals?
I think we would be actually a bit shocked if that happened, Just like, think about it, we'd actually be a bit like, what? Raise our eyebrows quite a lot. So I know, obviously, it's not that simple. And I've also been writing about that quite recently. That's why I got kind of in this Brexit thing. It's kind of a long procedure. So the UK would have to kind of start with formally declaring the whole UK that they want to join. And then all the member states would have to accept that. And you have to agree sort of conditions for UK rejoining. With all that, what comes with that, like how much should it pay? How much opt-outs would they have? Do they have to accept everything? There's a long kind of procedure there, which would take many, many years. Like, well, not a decade, but it would take several years from the formal declaration. And I think that would be successful, although people are, skeptical about that. I mean, if there was actually like a real declaration, cross-party consensus in the UK, for example, which now seems impossible. But
it will happen. I think it will happen for sure.
Eventually will happen.
The Conservatives will go to the right and then they will come back towards the centre.
Yeah, I think so too. That's also very likely. And then when you have this cross-party consensus, you can unilaterally declare it. I mean, we're looking at maybe 1 or 2 elections in the UK in the future for this to happen, The political narrative is definitely not there at the moment. That's where we're looking at. And then when you start that procedure with the unilateral declaration, then, well, the Commission and the member states have to negotiate with the UK. And that's going to be a tough negotiations. But if you reach that stage, the UK is going to join again. We're getting there is the difficult part.
So there's basically quite a lot of diplomatic work to do, maybe quite a lot of trust building before you can say we want to be married again.
They're kind of pragmatic also. So, I mean, if the UK internally has politically decided we are going to rejoin the EU project, I think the EU is very pragmatic in terms of, well, let's make it happen. Sort of. That would be the perspective from the EU. Because UK is, a big trading partner. It would be sensible, and a big political partner, it would be sensible to have them back in the bloc as well. I mean, from a political, economic perspective. So, yeah.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
The other thing, Jacob, is that because it's a long-term project, I think there is a tendency to look at the EU as a sort of static creature, but it's not. It's also constantly evolving. So it is important to know where it is heading so that you are aiming to join a thing that is real at that point in 5 years, in 10 years.
Yeah.
So what are the general trends within the EU at the moment for its own development?
Yeah.
Which way is it heading?
Ooh, that's a big question, right? But
it is a big question. I'm looking for a very general.
I think that's a fair question. It's what I actually think about myself a lot. So where I think the EU is heading in 5-10 years' time, the biggest kind of challenges which you are facing is enlargement. And, these kind of big questions on how do we act in the EU when we're a bigger EU with more member states? How do we get the budget to work? These kind of like long-term questions. So basically the contributions from member states need to increase. That's sort of like, especially when Ukraine joins the EU and Moldova, which, Georgia I don't really know about. But Moldova and Ukraine, they're joining. That's not unrealistic. That's kind of quite realistic, I think. How can states even manage Ukraine farming? Because that's kind of a big challenge now for, a lot of countries, because the farming products from Ukraine are, just about cheaper. So they would win the whole market in a way. if they would get free access to the agriculture market in the EU. I think there's also security, of course. That's kind of a big challenge. Like, it's about defense, etc. It's building up, all this like potential about that. So that's also one of the
defense.
big things.
Yeah, I think defense is somewhere where we will see some sort of development.
Oh, definitely.
Digital sovereignty. Every time I speak to people in Brussels, they go on about digital sovereignty. I have also heard some voices advocating maybe for something like Macron's concentric circles model, where they see the solution to a lot of the security and the immigration problems. They see the solution as having a sort of zone of intermediary membership, maybe in North Africa, that acts as a sort of buffer, something like that. Is that something you hear?
I heard about this idea as well. I think it's quite poorly developed. I always like these grand ideas, and I think they're interesting. But the concentric circles idea, which, is something from Macron, I think is poorly developed in the sense that this would kind of require a big treaty kind of chain revision conference. Like, this is like things that all member states would have to agree, and I think it's really unrealistic that this would happen. I think some people would like say, oh, well, UK can join by a concentric circle. Yeah, but maybe you should aim a bit higher than this. This is kind of like a very low sort of ambition solution. I think concentric circles is just not going to happen, to my mind. I don't see it happen with 27 member states agreeing to this.
Of course, in your own area, I know that you are a keen advocate of criminal justice being normalized somehow across the bloc, and you've written a book about it.
I think that's actually something which I can relate to the UK as well, and Brexit. I think that's where also the UK would like more cooperation with the EU. A lot more, actually, because the UK, if you talk to people working in police or prosecution services, they're really missing the kind of close cooperation that they had with Europol and Eurojust and these kind of agencies. So they would actually want to have more cooperation with Europol and preferably access to databases and all that. So you kind of see that there is a strong incentive for the UK criminal justice agencies to be.
And also, actually, it might be quite a smart thing, because it also opens a back door to maybe digital harmonization, because it's quite reasonable for the EU to say, well, look, if you want access to all these databases, then we're going to have to keep our digital laws somehow aligned.
Yes, definitely. I agree. And I think that's also, you could have agreements on that as well, which I don't. I think you can do that with still having the TCA agreement in place. You don't have to like amend the TCA to have these kind of agreements. And I think that
exactly, it can be a bolt-on.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a lot of things that can be done, without changing the TCA agreement. So I think this is particularly one of the things. And I think that when I read about Brexit and criminal justice, I just read, we really want to stay with Europol.
Yes.
We want to leave it. That's what kind of like the sort of the reaction from the criminal justice practitioners in the UK.
I can understand that.
We have a lot to discuss today, and I'm very much looking forward to working with you and to continue to strengthen our relation.
Thank you, Ursula. It's really fantastic to see you again. I firmly believe that the British public wants to return to pragmatic, sensible leadership when it comes to dealing with our closest neighbours.
There is much friendlier atmospherics in the last few months. That's absolutely true. But the sticking points, and I am quite surprised about this, especially on a youth mobility scheme, seem to persist. Now, some people say this is because the Starmer government wants the youth mobility scheme, which is something the EU wants, to be part of the bargaining in the bigger TCA review, talks for which will start next year. So they don't particularly want to give away this thing that the EU wants before the more general negotiation. What do you think of that?
I think that seems fairly convoluted, in my opinion. Sorry to say so, but I can definitely understand that this might be the approach from Starmer's top negotiation team, but I feel that this is going to be taken well. I think that the EU is very keen on separating the TCA, implementation, potential revisions with TCAs from everything else, because the TCA is quite like significant in terms of what it says. I do not see that that's going to work. Of course, this is difficult, but I think that Brussels is just going to say, guys, sorry, you have to give us something. Like,
right.
you gotta give us something. And we want youthability. We want more fishing rights. I mean, there is a new dispute now on fish.
I was going to ask you about that, because that renegotiation is coming up anyway. Is that going to be, again, the totemic thing that is a very small part of our economies but becomes the stumbling block over everything?
It is a bit of a stumbling block, because I think that the EU doesn't see this as very unreasonable asks and demands to get like more fishing rights that they think they already have a right to, according to, or they think that they already have these rights. If the UK wish to sort of negotiate a little bit here, I think that would show a lot of goodwill, and maybe they will even get, another deal on something if they just can kind of like get this, get this solved, this kind of fishing problem. If the EU requests an arbitration tribunal, you can understand that the politics has completely failed.
Yeah, we don't want to end up again in a situation where we're taking each other to court. That's not conducive to a negotiation at all. Jacob, there is a lot of excitement among nerds on both sides of the Brexit debate over here about an obscure piece of legislation currently going through, the Product Regulation and Metrology Bill. Is that at all on your radar?
It is, of course. I think that it's quite like a funny piece of legislation. It's not only among nerds, because I think it's sort of like, it's a piece of legislation which gives the UK government's ministers possibilities to unilaterally align product regulation with environmental impacts, I think it is, with EU regulation. And
safety legislation.
I think that's kind of broad scopes. I think that covers a lot of consumer products, and I think that that's very good for business that wants to export to the EU. That's definitely a very good development, a very positive development. It's a very small step, and it doesn't give full market access, etc. But I mean, it's definitely a good step forward.
But you do see it. You do agree that it's a kind of backdoor into dynamic alignment.
Yes, it is definitely a backdoor into what I would say, joking and like upset all the Brexiteers. It's a rolling Brexit measure completely. It is definitely. It's just stupid. It's taking so long time to do. But I think this is very good, and I think this is definitely the right kind of development. I think this is kind of seems to be Labour's way of doing it. They really don't want to do anything spectacularly. It goes back to where Labour is as a party. They seem to be very divided on Brexit and EU. So it seems to be some kind of like uncertainty in the party. Like, where are we going? Well, we have to. We have to appease the EU people, the Remainers. We have to appease them. They're the majority. We still have the Brexiteers in the party as well, so we have to appease them as well. So we do this like little small thing which no one maybe noticed.
Because the problem is that you look across to countries like Germany and France and Italy, and it makes you really quite nervous about maybe giving more ammunition to the far-right populist parties to say they're trying to con you, they're ignoring what you want and doing their own thing anyway. And I think that is part of the nervousness, to be honest.
I think it's played out horribly, that kind of idea and narrative. I'm like looking at my own country, Sweden. I think that is a mission to fail completely, because you can never imitate the real far right. Like in Sweden we have the Swedish Democrats. They're sort of like, I mean, it seems like the way of like we try to imitate them, but we're not really the real deal. I mean, not really believing it. I mean, you can see politicians, they're not really believing it. If you play their game, you're going to probably lose. I think that's what also political scientists.
But at the same time, Jacob, if you had told me 20 years ago that in 2020 Norway would have a conservative coalition with a far-right government, which it did for a couple of years, I would have laughed at you. In January, you wrote that the trade-offs on the UK side were a little bit absent from the debate. Do you think the UK has now begun to internalize its status as, I guess, applicant? Or are there signs that it still thinks it is somehow driving the process?
I think with the Labour, it's definitely different, I think. I mean, I was also studying a lot like how the Tories were managing the relationship, and compared to Labour, I think Labour is less outwardly sort of saying that they're driving. The communication department, Labour, needs to do a lot of work. But, I think there is kind of a more sense that we have to sort of tread carefully here, and we have to be constructive. We're still going to say that we're an equal partner to the EU, but, I see more constructive input from Labour government than it used to be. And I think in the sense that we have to see ourselves as a third country. We are an applicant. We want these things. They're very important for us. So that maybe we need to give something to the EU. I think I see more of this dialogue, and I see this definitely more a more positive light in this. I think it's slowly internalizing with the new government. Slowly.
Yeah, slowly being the operative word. So what I'm getting from you is that you think the first term of a Labour government will be one of maybe restoring some normality to relations, maybe small incremental wins on the fringes, but nothing majorly strident. Is that a fair summary? That's
a very fair summary, given the Labour Party's sort of own internal division in the party on the EU question. I think this is what we can expect. And also the mandate, which I know I told a lot of people before elections that, if they say this before elections, they really cannot change the day number one. Everyone, they're just going to say when they come to government, they're going to change. There would have been political suicide. There would have been like new elections, They would have said, okay, we're going to join the EU internal market now. That wouldn't have worked for the Labour government to do that. So I think there is going to be small incremental changes. They're going to be positive, and they will happen for sure. But I think there is Starmer and his team needs to work harder on this. They need to set out more clearly. They need to think, okay, where can we compromise? What can we give the EU? And the EU also needs to become a bit more invested. Maybe we don't have to treat UK as a third country. Maybe we can actually invest a little bit more in this relationship, because they're quite a big country. It's actually a lot of our business actually trade with the UK, although less than before. There are a lot of business that would be happy with the EU also if we can trade better with the UK.
No, I think you're right. We tend to always pick on the British government, but there is an aspect of the EU stance that is also a little bit performative, a little bit. You wanted to be out, so now you're out. My final question is this. With more countries wanting to join from the East, and this continuing Russian threat, and the potential of a Trump presidency to the West, might that be something that pushes the EU to maybe reconsider some of its red lines, and the UK to hug each other a little bit closer?
You're definitely right in that. I think that there is if that would happen, all of our worst sort of nightmares be sort of realized. I think that the EU political leaders would be happy to have a close relationship with the UK. That would become even more important, because that's a big sort of third country in Europe that we want to have maybe better security relationship. We want to have maybe better trade relationship. There's going to be an incentive for the EU to open up to the UK if, things in the world go downhill, which, is quite likely.
Yeah, it's certainly on a knife edge at the moment, but it's strange to think that horrible possibility might actually have a positive effect
It would have a positive effect, I think, on the relationship. It would become more important, more prioritized. For example, if Ukraine and Moldova accession will be sort of slowed down and we will become like stuck, then the EU will look to the UK, one of the countries outside the EU which are closest to the EU.
Yeah, because then defense goes to the top of the priority list, and the UK is a big part of that conversation.
The UK has a lot to offer in terms of defense, for sure.
Thank you very much, Jacob Öberg. Thank you. We will drop a link to your article from January and to your brilliant book on EU criminal justice, which is open access, I think. So I hope to chat again to you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. It was very nice. Super nice.
Quiet, Riot.
If I were to summarize the mistakes that Britain made in how it approached the European Union, really from the very start, it would come down to two simple things. The first is a failure to understand that a partnership need not be a constant zero-sum game where for one to win the others must necessarily lose. The framing of an alliance, primarily by Thatcher in her later, rather mad period, as something hostile over there, to which one must go prepared to handbag other leaders in order to not be somehow exploited, is one of the most wrong-headed and damaging political narratives of the last few decades. The second is related, and it is to view the European Union as a primarily political entity hiding behind a veneer of rules. It is in fact the opposite, a primarily rules-based complex organism which tries, often uncomfortably, to accommodate politicians. This doesn't mean that its overarching imperatives are not political, or that it doesn't bend to accommodate electoral realities. It does, provided they can find a way to be accommodated within the rules. But there is also, in my experience, running through its DNA, a profound sense that the project is bigger than the politicians or the trends that come and go, and that the only way for the project to survive, for a partnership of 6, 10, 15, 27 countries to thrive, is for the rules to be respected. And so if there is a single piece of advice that I would give to all those who want, one day, to rejoin the greatest peace project in history, it would be to bear those two things in mind. A unilateral and premature declaration would be to perpetuate the same exceptionalism that delivered Brexit. We must, as Jacob says, internalise the UK's status as applicant and understand that rejoin will only be within reach when it is the settled will of the UK and every EU member state, and that when it does happen, it will happen according to the same accession rules that apply to Croatia and will apply to Moldova. In short, a closer relationship does not magically result from unilateral political desire. Without the political desire, it can't happen. That is true. But desire alone is not enough. Such is the nature of trust. It is hard to establish, easy to ruin, and even more difficult to rebuild. If you enjoy our work, you can support our work on ko-fi.com/Quiet Riot Pod. And saying something nice about us publicly is also a wonderful boost. We shall meet again on Sunday School, first thing tomorrow morning. Until then.
Quiet Riot is an audio production by Cooler Heads, with Naomi Smith, Alex Andreu and Kenny Campbell. Music by Mariana Sangeeta, artwork by Simona Canelu. Quiet Riot is a co-production with Soundstone Global.
Quiet Riot.